All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is week 5. So we are wrapping up our course very quickly here. I hope everybody's coming along well with your final papers. Don't forget that you not only owe me the final paper on the last day of class, but you also owe me the final draft of your short paper. Either the critical analysis of Bonfire, the critical analysis of Death of the Salesman, or the book review of Consumer Rights, which very few people chose to do. So regardless, those are all due there. It will take me a few days to grade these things. I'm collecting, 8, 2,000 to 3,000 word essays. Some of you are at 3,000 words. Some of you, are closer to 2. But either way, we're talking, somewhere between 8 and 12 pages typically. I've got 8 of those to read and grade and assess, and then a couple of short papers too. I'm going to have like about 8 of those, around 3 pages. So if you don't see grades immediately, that's what it's about. Although I will be spending most of the weekend just grading. So last day of class is Friday of week 6. And let's make sure to be on top of that. This week we are going to talk very, very briefly about materialism in terms of consumerism and, the purchasing of symbols, but also the way that consumerism begins to affect ideas. This is something I think that comes up a lot in the latter half of the 20th century. We've seen it in the 19th century when we read Consumer Rights. That was one of the big points of that book. Let's see if my cat decides to interfere. Sorry if the hand off camera scratching the cat. But I think we could see that in the latter part of the 20th century and in the contemporary moment as well. So I'm going to go back to my tried and true, which is religion, and talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about televangelists today, and what a thing we call the prosperity gospel. And also going to talk about what we would call sort of the contemporary Christian industries, contemporary Christian music, contemporary Christian booksellers, and such. So, anyway, that's where we're going to be zoning in for the next few minutes. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I grew up, I was a preacher's kid, and spent a lot of time in a little bookstore in Lancaster. It was called Provident. And when I say little bookstore, it was actually a fairly large bookstore. They sold books, they sold clothing, t-shirts and such, sweatshirts, banners and flags and, things like that. Home decorations, music, and, of course, books. So, you have this very large sort of like supercenter type of place where everything is religious in its overtones. Now, Provident, this store, was owned by a Mennonite family. For those of you who are not familiar with the Mennonite sect of the Anabaptist Church, Mennonites come in a lot of different varieties, from almost Amish, and very conservative, not driving cars or only driving black cars, and then they paint all the chrome black and such, because they don't want to appear ostentatious, all the way up to people who are strolling about and you would never know that they were Mennonites by any outward sign. And then there's all points between. One of the more common Mennonite images is the person who wears the dresses a little bit more conservatively. For women, that's oftentimes a skirt. and a blouse of some type. You're not going to see short skirts. You're going to see about ankle length, and sort of the classic Mennonite uniform that we used to joke about was the ankle length jean skirt with a pair of sneakers and some sort of t-shirt, and the prayer covering on the back of the woman's head. These can be created at home. They can be purchased, which is fascinating, purchasing these kind of sacred articles, right? What does it mean when you make it yourself versus when you buy it? Doesn't that sound like a familiar question? I believe Lee Eric Schmidt asked something very, very similar when he talked about Valentines and puzzle purses and those kinds of things. So we see this, these kinds of theories pop up over and over and over again, right? And so this is sort of the stereotypical Mennonite that a lot of people think of, or at least a lot of people in the circles that I ran when I was a kid. We thought of it that way, and indeed that's what this family was. They were not Amish, or didn't appear Amish or act Amish or anything. They drove cars and such. But they definitely were on the more conservative side of social issues, in terms of they very much believed in traditional gender roles. The woman was to stay home and take care of the kids and have lots of them, large families and such, and the men were to run the public sphere, the marketplace, and the political world. Anyway, I spent many, many hours in this particular bookstore, though, because, as I said, my father was a pastor, and we would go down there because he always wanted to find new books that were written by other ministers, so that he could read them and see what he wanted, if he wanted to preach something from those books, or before they were pastors, they were youth pastors, and so, they would look at Christian music. This is music that is produced by at least ostensibly Christian artists, with a very explicit Christian message. I'm not talking here about Christian music like U2, some sort of very subtle spirituality to their songs. I'm talking, songs like God Good, Devil Bad. Like that was actually the title of a song by a band. DeGarmo and Key, I think, was their name back then. There were bands like Petra, which in Hebrew means rock. That's where the name Peter comes from. It was Petra, there was White Cross. For any of you who are closer to my age, Striper, Christian heavy metal, was amazing. Actually really bad. But all of these things being sold and being commodified and being marketed there. So this is something to think about, kind of how does this affect religious display and religious practice. One of the ways was that it created sort of small businesses within churches. Many churches during the 80s and 90s, as this sort of Christian contemporary industry of music and books and clothing and such sprang up, many churches opened a small book table in the back of the church where there'd be books that people could purchase, and then they added music to it. And all of a sudden, every church is banned. These are churches that are more contemporary in their approach to sacred music. Every church is banned. Wanted to make their own album, right? And then they could do their thing and they could sell some, and then they could buy better guitars with it, I guess. But, so it starts off with just a couple of books as a way, the pastor's preaching a sermon about this topic, and now we have a book on that topic back on the book table that you can purchase if you want to read more about it. Okay? And then we add the music, and then they started adding t-shirts, and this is not a Christian t-shirt per se, but t-shirts like this, where they would have some sort of picture, image, and words on them, that again were affiliating people with the church that my dad was the assistant pastor, and youth pastor, my mom, this was a church that believed in ordaining both men and women. So my parents, both of them were pastors, reverend, and they were both assistant pastors, youth pastors. They ran the Helps ministry, which was all the behind-the-scenes stuff, like ushering and tape duplication and running the book table and cleaning crew and all that. And of course they were the youth pastors. And my mother also played piano on the music team, on the band and whatnot. So they were very involved, clearly, right? And the first t-shirts that were sold there were t-shirts that were for the church. The church was called New Wine Christian Center, based off of a verse where it talks about you can't put new wine in old wineskins. In other words, you have to change. And so the church was called New Wine Christian Center, and the symbol was like a thing of grapes and like a circle with like a Bible behind it or something. Anyway, the point of the story is, I started selling these t-shirts, and it's fascinating. Again, here we have materialism jumping into the church and becoming a way for people within the church to identify each other and to also advertise for the church. So there's like a sort of product placement aspect here, sort of free advertising. In fact, people are paying you so that they can advertise for you. Then the youth group created their own t-shirts to advertise the youth group. Now this is back in the day when the no fear shirts were a real big deal. No fear and then some sort of witty slogan. They did one that said, on the front, it said no fear, KNOW, and it had the verse underneath of it that talks about, do not fear he who has the power to destroy the body, yea, fear he who has the power to destroy the soul and cast you into hell. That kind of thing. That was on the front, and then on the back it was no fear, N-O fear, and it was a verse about, fear not, for I am with you always, kind of thing, the words of Christ. So anyway, again, and then it had the Impact Youth Ministry logo on it too, right? So again, this way of advertising, a way of raising money, a way of, this isn't quite creating profit here because it's a non-profit organization, it's a church. So the money from these t-shirt sales were funding lock-ins, and we supported children in other countries. We would send money every month, so that kids could go to school and such. Also, we would take missions trips every summer. We would go overseas, usually Mexico, Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, that region and such. And, we built homes, built churches, clean up after hurricanes, those kinds of things. And the money from this went to that cause, so that the kids didn't have to pay as much. Point is, a couple of things here. One, I want to point that out because there is this sense, the word materialism has a real pejorative sense to it, a real negative connotation. And here I'd argue, this is probably neutral value-wise. Yes, it's commodifying religious faith to some extent, but it's also, the t-shirts are being sold at the same cost as a t-shirt at the store. So, why not just buy one to support a particular cause instead of supporting a profit center like a corporation? And of course then there's causes that it goes to. But the interesting aspect for me, though, like I said here, is that we do have to get away from this sense somehow that materialism is always a negative thing. It's always bad. That stuff is evil. A very sort of Gnostic philosophy here, right? Anyway, so this is one aspect that I wanted to talk about, was the sort of rise of this industry. And really, it's very much in response to the 1960s. The 1960s, this decade of just trouble. There's teenagers, hippies, and Vietnam, and rock and roll, and the Beatles. No one knows what's going on. Drugs, free love, sexual revolution, second wave feminism, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, all of these things. Sex and the Single Girl, great book to read as a historical artifact here. These things are kind of coming into the culture. And popular culture is sweeping through the country with all of these things attached to it. And many within the church felt that they needed an answer to it. And much like they had done in the 19th century with the holidays, they did the same thing with the commodification, sort of theory here, where they said, well, if we can't beat them, join them. Our kids are going to want to listen to rock and roll regardless. And so by the early 70s, rather than saying, well, just, don't listen to rock and roll, which had been the message through the 1950s, from the church. In the 1970s, one of the first Christian musicians and artists, his name was Larry Norman, will come out and will start playing guitar. Actually was a great, great guitarist. Good songwriter, quite talented, and had a career in the secular marketplace prior to, kind of coming into the Christian marketplace. And then other people joined him. Again, bands like Petra, which was a sort of Christian rock band that did sort of 70s style arena rock, and then in the 80s, added a lot more keyboard, which was kind of the thing to do. And ended up being kind of a Christian hair band, if that makes sense. White Cross, led by a guy named Rex Carroll. There was a band called Rez, or the Resurrection Band, that was led by a guy named Glenn Kaiser. Glenn Kaiser had actually played guitar with Jimi Hendrix at one point, did some studio work for him and such. Another big name would be Phil Keaggy, who is a guitar virtuoso. You'd have to listen to the man's playing. He truly is amazing. And the point is these artists were there to provide an alternative. Essentially what the church is saying, there's nothing we can do to stop what's happening. We can't beat them. So we're just going to create an alternative. And how do we recognize people who are part of our community? By those who engage in the alternative in Christian music. When I was a young person, when I was growing up in the 80s and the 90s and such, up until I was in my mid-teens, I did not listen to any music that was not explicitly Christian music. My parents had a very firm rule: no secular music in our house. And they would throw it away, break your tape, whatever. This is back in the days of cassette tapes, and CDs were just coming out. So the point is, this was a cultural marker that was communicated, right, through materialism, through consumerism, consumption. And we saw the same thing with books. There's a whole slew of Christian novels. For example, he's actually quite a good writer. His name's Frank Peretti. Frank Peretti wrote a series of books that were incredibly influential. This Present Darkness was the first book. Piercing the Darkness was the second book, and the third book was called Prophet. Was a trilogy. And the point is, these books took the Christian world of sort of evangelical Christianity by storm. Everybody read Frank Peretti. Frank Peretti was assigned at my high school. I went to a small private school. Again, my parents sent me there. It was assigned reading. When I was in 8th grade, we read This Present Darkness and Piercing the Darkness. This Present Darkness was an anti-abortion novel. Piercing the Darkness was anti-spirituality or spiritualism, New Age, healing crystals type of stuff. It was very opposed to those kinds of things. And then Profit was, again, about the abortion industry to some extent, but then was also sort of a lot about politics. So these 3 books were incredibly important for people. Again, it gave us a way of feeling part of a group, part of a special group, and then you tie that to the religious conviction, and it just gets really interesting the way that one can feel a certain exclusivity because, well, I don't listen to Guns N' Roses. And some people look at that as a bad thing. Guns N' Roses had some great songs, but at the time, we kind of looked at it as we don't listen to Guns N' Roses, we listen to White Cross or Petro or whomever. And it became this sort of way to identify in-group and out-group people. And there was a lot of peer pressure to purchase particular albums and, particular types of clothing and particular books and house decorations and all of these kinds of things. So this is just, I'm not going to go further. I mean, it would be fascinating. We could sit here and talk about this for days. This is part of my doctoral dissertation is actually on this phenomenon. And there are some really great books out there. There's a really good one called Sympathy for the Devil, which is about the origins of Christian contemporary music. Stephen Prothero, in a book that he wrote called American Jesus, he has a chapter that deals with sort of, this topic that I'm talking about, particularly in terms of Christian music and a sort of Christian counterculture, the, quote, Jesus people, the sort of Christian hippies. But the point is, we're going to end here. This is just a sort of my ramblings to give you a sense of one more way that consumption, materialism, and all this stuff comes into American life, and how not only does it affect the culture, but it's a product of the culture. Without the hippies, without the turmoil of the 1960s, Christian contemporary music and the bookstores and those kinds of things would never have been necessary. Without the Roe v. Wade decision, nothing, the stuff wouldn't have been necessary. Without, I believe it was 63 or 65, I forget which year, that the Supreme Court decided to remove teacher-led prayer from public schools. Again, all of this, these sorts of things happening that created an atmosphere in which evangelicals felt under assault. And so they ran to their own little in-group and formed this sort of counterculture, subculture. And then materials and stuff became a way of identifying with that. All right? So I'm actually going to record a second video to deal with what I was talking about with the prosperity gospel and televangelists, but I wanted to kind of make that connection here with all of this stuff because I just find it so interesting with what we're talking about. So this is part 1. Be looking for part 2, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.